Welcome to Fundamentals of Macroeconomics. In this unit, we will talk about inequality. This chapter is concerned about the question of distribution. It's not enough to say that the average is prospering. And as we can see from the city of Recife, Brazil, some areas of the same city experience significant economic prosperity, while others experience economic harm. First, we'll need to discuss the data. What are the measures of income distribution? This graph splits up society into 5 portions. Each quintile represents 20% of the population based on relative income. The poorest quintile earns around 3% of the total income in the country, whereas the highest 20% earn over half of the total income in the country. The height of each bar represents the mean income in that group. So folks in the third quintile, right in the middle, what we traditionally would think of the middle class, are earning on average $75,000 a year. And we can see a significant rise by the time we get to the top, where the average income is around $250,000 a year. Being in the bottom 20% places folks in poverty. Average incomes are less than $20,000 a year. And think about the cost of living. How much does it cost to pay rent or to buy groceries, to pay for clothing or healthcare? Understanding the disparity here is very important to help us comprehend the varied experience that people have in the country. Oftentimes, we only associate with people in our similar income bracket, and we have an innate instinct to assume everyone is experiencing something like us. But the reality is there's so many different ways that people experience their economic life. Another way of measuring inequality is by looking at wealth. Income is how much money you make each year, whereas wealth is how much you've accumulated over time. Wealth can include things like owning stocks, owning businesses, owning real estate, or other forms of assets. The wealth disparity is far stronger than what we see at the income level. The bottom half of the country owns just 2% of the total assets in the entire economy, while some in the bottom 50% do own their home or have collected some savings or own their small business. The cumulative proportion of it is puny relative to the total wealth in the economy. The next 40%, what we would think of as the upper middle class, own around a third of the total wealth in the economy, but the vast majority of the wealth is simply held by the top 10%. In gray, the 90 to 99% have a third, whereas the 1% all by themselves own the other third. Altogether, the top 10% own 71% of the economy's wealth. And so why does this matter? A lot of the decisions and rules in the country are based upon political influence, and political power is heavily influenced by those with the resources to lobby the government. And folks have other concerns about fairness. How much of this wealth was earned through hard working or smart innovation? And then how much of this wealth was simply by luck or by inheritance? These are active questions in debate that inform our moral values and in turn our policy choices to address them. Some wonder whether the levels of inequality we have are inevitable. Right off the bat, it's important to note that nobody is advocating for perfect equality. There are some debates about the particular magnitude of inequality in any given period. If we look at the top 1% or 0.1%, the levels of inequality we see today have not always been so. I like this chart because it goes back 100 years. The levels of inequality we have today were similar to what we saw in the 1920s and 1930s. But after the Second World War and through the 50s and 60s, society became relatively more equal. But for the past 50 years has reverted to become more unequal. Now, the 1950s and 1960s were periods of very strong economic growth and prosperity. So it stands to reason we could achieve those levels of inequality again without any dire consequences. It's not a question of theory, it's a question of history. We've successfully done this and seen this before. Many countries experience diverse levels of inequality. South Africa has one of the highest levels of inequality in the world. The Nordic countries, such as Finland, have one of the lowest levels of inequality. And the US is on the higher end for a country with a high GDP per capita. The particular measure here is called a Genie Coefficient. The higher the Genie Coefficient, the higher the inequality. You'll see this figure used in the media from time to time. And again, I think it shows there isn't a single country with perfect equality. The policy choices that we have seen and experimented on lead to a wide diversity of options. Now, inequality only measures the relative gap. The US has high inequality, but that doesn't tell us anything to how prosperous we are relative to the rest of the world. I really like this graph because it shows the inequality at a world level, not just a country level. And if we recall from before, even the poorest 10% in America, on average, are earning around $18,000. This places them significantly more wealthy than the average person in the world. Most of humans alive today, and most of humans alive in history, lived in significant poverty. This is the average experience. Now, while for the past 6,000 years, humans have had kings and other elites that have experienced significant wealth and prosperity, it has only been in the past 150 years or so that a rising middle class has raised a significant portion of the population out of poverty. And the change has been dramatic. You simply can't emphasize this graph enough. We're looking at GDP per capita in England going back 1,000 years. And yes, these numbers are adjusted for inflation. The prosperity the average person in England today experiences is simply a miracle compared to what it was merely 200 years earlier.